Thank you.
And let's see, Fire 3 finished out on the 17th. I don't have the final numbers yet, but I know it's about, from last week, I was looking at around a little over 39,000 cubic yards with all sites.
Yeah, just a little bit on the grant funding. So folks that submitted that received an award for the fall 22 Firewise grant funding, which we're asking for deliverables by June 30th. We didn't really come up with a process as far as what information we need. So if you haven't already, if you could just email me invoices, any photos of the work that was done, and just a small project description, like just a paragraph of the work that was done, kind of highlighting what the funding was used for. I think that will be acceptable for the funding that we just gave out this spring for the 23 spring funding. I will have a fillable form with the ability to upload some documents, just like the application was. It'll probably be in the same location. So please just stay tuned for that. I haven't completed it yet. I'll have to work with our IT group to get that figured out, but we'll have it a little more streamlined as far as getting that information. So again, for the fall 22 stuff, just send me anything you have, invoices, photos, project description. For the spring 23 grant, please be patient. I'm trying to come up with a fillable form for that so you could submit your deliverables. The other thing is the $500,000 grant that we got from Oregon State Fire Marshal. Oregon Living with Fire was the group that applied for that on our behalf. Thank you again, Jody and Jennifer and Joe, for doing that. We're going to actually transfer that over to the county now, and we do have a meet and greet kind of meeting, a kickoff meeting on July 11th that myself and Corinne are going to attend. So that'll be, we'll kind of have some more information after then as far as like how that funding will work. But essentially, the county got $500,000. We have 3 years to spend it. The three main groups that we applied for was increasing our Firewise funding for the fall, projects that are for underserved communities. We have $25,000 a year that we can use for underserved communities. And then we have a fair amount of funding for sweat equity projects. And, you know, that's something that'll take some time. We'll have to work through that this summer, how that's going to look on the ground, but it'll probably be some kind of application process where we try and garner the interest of all the communities that need that kind of work, and then try and get that funding out on the ground. That's all I got for grant funding. Does anyone have any questions with that? Okay, that's all I had, Corinne, for updates.
I have a question.
Yeah.
For the sweat equity programs, are you still going to have it to where like individual property owners sign up so that you know what needs to be done where?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure how it was done in the past.
I think it was working better, you know, than just like a whole community.
Yeah.
Because different individual properties don't always know what are going on, and that way there's some accountability that goes back to them too. If they say, okay, I want this, then you know.
Yeah, I mean, either at the individual or community level. I mean,
it's kind of a combo. You pick a community,
yeah,
and then you have the
then you know what individuals are within that
buy-in. Yeah,
it'd probably be something to that extent.
I think the last go-arounds were working pretty good that way, so you might just check that out.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to request input as far as putting that together, how that's going to work, if what has worked well in the past and how we can do it in the future. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So did the BLM funding, that 50,000, did that all get allocated?
No, it hasn't been allocated. I have 2 or 3 projects I'm looking at right now that potentially can be using that funding. And then we had the funding at Eagle Crest used 20,000 of that funding. So there's about 30,000 left.
Okay, so there's still 30,000 left. Okay, and there's no requirement that it has to be 110 acres or anything like that?
No, the main thing is it just has to, you know, preferably be in areas adjacent to BLM land. We prioritize defensible space, so 100 feet around your homes, and that's primarily because it's just not a lot of funding. So we want to make sure that the funding is going towards, you know, the area where we can, you know, reduce the most fire risk. And so that's why we're thinking around there. And then it doesn't really matter if it's a community or a private individual, they can be eligible for it too. We don't really have an application process for it.
Okay, so like Mackenzie Canyon, that's, you know, such a fire trap, depending if a fire starts in that area with the wind, like the wind was blowing, what night was it? Was it Sunday night that it was blowing at my house? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So those neighbors, I should really have a meeting, talk to them more, those neighbors.
Yeah, there's, you know, between the Buttes Basin funding and the BLM community assistance agreement, I'm trying to, that whole Sisters area, basically between Sisters and Redmond, there's a lot of interest for using grant funding. So we're trying to just whatever best fits for that particular community. Like I think Squaw Creek Estates I've been working with, Peaks 360. There's a private landowner out there that has a fair amount of land. Those are just some of the folks that I've been working with right now. And we'll use probably either that BLM funding or the Buttes Basin.
Okay.
Any more questions? Okay.
So today we have a presentation, and I really hope I don't pronounce your last name incorrectly, Amanda, please correct me. I believe Amanda Robb from Oregon Department of Forestry. She's going to be presenting for us on prescribed fire. I think she might be having some audio issues. If not.
Yeah, I am. My computer's just rebooting right now, so
Okay.
I'm gonna get my presentation fired up and hopefully get logged in from my computer while I talk to you guys here for a second. Yeah, I think some people might like the way you pronounce my last name and think it's appropriate, but Rao is my last name. I also at one point worked in Central Oregon and also went by the last name of Stamper. Have a lot of history of working over there. Love that area, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person today. I appreciate the opportunity to present remotely. I am in a new position with ODF. It was part of the Senate Bill 762 omnibus wildfire bill package to hire a prescribed work coordinator when that was mandated that ODF stand up a certified burn manager program. So that's really the primary focus I have. I'm going to try to avoid an echo here as I try to log in. Hopefully this will work. Tactical pause, guys. Hold on. I gotta try. My phone is wonky when it comes to trying to mute myself on it. Here. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate your patience here. This is kind of crazy. Okay, I'm gonna get out of here.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. Step one, I'm logged in. Step 2, I'm gonna pull up my presentation while I'm talking to you guys. So yeah, I worked for the Deschutes. They're out of Sisters. Also worked out on the Ochoco, have a lot of time with the Forest Service. Also worked for the Nature Conservancy, OSU Extension. Did some time with the BLM, both as a temp early in my career and on a detail doing post-fire emergency stabilization and rehab coordinating out of Prineville. But most of my work really focuses on prescribed fire, and that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. Let's see. Oh, let me show you my face here too. All right. So yeah, I was asked to talk about prescribed fire ecology, so I put together a presentation that sort of combines a discussion of fire ecology with what prescribed fire looks like, and I hope it is what you guys are looking for here today. And then I'm happy to answer questions, especially if they relate to either the specifics around burning in that area, because I have done a lot of burning on the Deschutes, or the specifics of ODF's involvement in prescribed fire and what we're trying to do to increase that amount of prescribed fire on non-federal lands. So with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen, share my presentation. You guys see that?
Yes. Yes.
Good. Sorry if my computer does some stuff. I literally restarted it for this because it wasn't doing well for me, and it might be rebooting, doing some rebooting or updating stuff. So I appreciate your patience. All right. So just a real general overview about fire ecology. What is it? Well, it's the relationship of fire to both the living and the non-living environment. And that takes into account a whole bunch of different things. So, it's not just a biological ecology that we're talking about. There's a social ecology to it, and it takes into account fire history, ecology that may not be considered very much influenced by fire even. And how this interacts with the wild and urban interface, I think, is particularly interesting, especially in fire-prone environments like Central Oregon. Talking a little bit about how fuel treatments interact with fire ecology, and then, considering how wildlife is impacted by fire and how it's applied. So those are just some things that you would want to think about with regards to fire ecology in general. And then when we talk about prescribed fire ecology, it's like a whole other layer. This is what everybody already knows, but it's foundational in terms of talking about any of these things when it comes to fire ecology. How fire burns is influenced by weather, which is highly variable, fuels, which are almost as highly variable as weather in some forms, and then of course the less variable topographical environment does vary, but not as much and not as often. I think this is mostly accurate. Where the little star there you see that's yellow is showing where Bend is in terms of precipitation gradients and how they relate to fire frequency. So, you get more frequent fire, less time in between fires. So this is, intervals and severity, looking at intervals and severity. So in a place like Bend, of course, you need short intervals for low severity effects that are tend to favor the development of ponderosa pine in that high seral complex. It's interesting maintaining an old growth characteristic, if you will, with that high frequency, low intensity disturbance. But as you go up in elevation and you get more precipitation, you get less frequent fire and you get higher intensities when it does occur. So some of what's happening with the shifts in fire ecology have to do with introducing these longer intervals that then produce higher intensities that were not historically present. So those older trees are just not made to withstand that. The only part I'm not sure I agree with in this
graphic is the part about the juniper woodland, because I think juniper woodlands can go a lot longer without fire than what this would suggest. Because of, in some of those places where it's real rocky and such, there's not often enough fuel to burn, but more than like 25 to 75 years. But otherwise, I think this is a good way of describing kind of where Ben says. And tree ring analysis is how fire history is determined. So it's reconstructed by taking all this information from stumps, analyzing them, and then determining how often fire is supposed to occur. So that's the fire history side. So this is a fairly common picture, but one that just shows what historically a lot of ponderosa pine stands look like. I believe this was actually taken in Montana, but it's still relevant in terms of that stand structure. And then along comes the fire suppression approach, right? But fire had this important role, right? It was maintaining what we see above, which is that open characteristic of the stand with some pockets of younger growth coming up. And, you get out 80 years or so and you have a lot of decadent accumulation and not the open structure anymore. So keep the fire present, you'll change the structure over time, shifting things around a little bit, but overall it'll stay relatively the same. And this shows how that happens, in that same time frame of 80 years. And, it's like, yeah, it really does become a monster to strike down when you let it go for that long and you've kept fire out. So kind of creating the very conditions that we say we don't want by keeping fire out of the picture. So yeah, we're looking at what once was fire frequently maintained forests to ones that can't handle what happens when you keep fire out for that long and then it does burn in the area. So some of the things that start to interact with historical fire suppression would be drought and pathogens and pests, and that creates even more conditions for challenges when it comes to maintaining historical fire ecology conditions and figuring out what to do when it comes to prescribed fire. Just one really quick example, working as sisters, there were a lot of sanitation cuts done to try to deal with mistletoe. And, when the mistletoe is present, it tends to actually create stuff that likes to burn even more. And so then you kind of have to decide how to manage for that with fire after something has already been done with mechanical treatments. Drought is also impacting how some of the treatments are affecting the residual stand. And so those historical fire suppression conditions have led to a lot of this, but then is part of the restoration and sort of conservation scenario that has to be endeavored from there. So we all know a lot about the importance of fire. I don't think I'm speaking to an audience of people that doesn't understand that. We know that it removes hazardous fuels. It's important for forest health. It does things we don't even understand completely. It is necessary for regeneration and creation and maintenance of wildlife habitat, and of course, risk reduction in our communities. So, when you're looking around at some of what happens as a result of fire suppression, this is the result of some of that insect infestation. That slide was out of order. It was supposed to be higher up when we were talking about that. Sorry about that. So now I kind of wanted to look at, these successional conditions and where do we put prescribed fire in that scenario? You have over on the very far left-hand side a bare landscape with nothing. That's a brand new clean slate. And all the way on the right-hand side, you have a climax community that hasn't been disturbed for a very long time. Now, there's some places in Oregon, like, for example, the Willamette Valley, where there's a fire regime or fire return interval, if you will, of like every 3 years. So I wouldn't say it's keeping it in a barren landscape because it's very productive here, so it doesn't stay barren for very long, but it is keeping a pioneer community, or maybe not a pioneer community, but an early, what they call early cereal, those initial plants that come in after disturbance. It's keeping those as the dominant and not letting anything form from there. And there's a bunch of endangered species that are reliant on that. So that's, you can put prescribed fire over in that pioneer species place. But really, most of what it is doing is trying to maintain more of that climax community, in some cases in between the intermediate and climax. But where it says that red disturbance, it's kind of creating that cycle where as the intermediate community comes up and it starts to threaten that climax community, which is the overstory, you reduce it, and that's the cycle. So what I'm trying to say is that where it says disturbance, it's really, this is where prescribed fire is doing its work, is in taking that intermediate community, knocking it back to maintain the climax community. And that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about connecting prescribed fire with the ecology side, which interestingly, I've given a lot of presentations and I haven't exactly been asked to give this one. So this has been kind of a different thing for me to put together, but it's been cool to think about. So I also just wanted to touch on some of the things that are related to fire adaptations within that whole scenario that I just described. Thick-walled seeds and spores, or in some cases, seeds that are, so thick-walled seeds, meaning they are protective of themselves against fire, but others are dependent, meaning they require fire to open them. So there's adaptations versus dependency are debated a bit actually, but in this case we're talking about adaptations, meaning they are able to withstand fire. So overwintering or dormancy, the ability to withstand higher pHs, and then it changes in food and nutrient sources and life strategies. So these are all things that plants, mushrooms, animals do to adapt to fire. And that's important when we're talking about introducing something that has a damaging effect for a positive net outcome. This is looking at soil, which I think is really important to note in terms of the impacts to soil from fire. These are different temperatures at which volatilization of nutrients occurs, okay? And then there's depths as well that are indicated over here in terms of how deep into the soil profile that goes. But it's indicating is it actually takes quite a bit of heat to volatilize nutrients from the soil. And the reason I bring this up here is because in wildfire scenarios, it's very much more common for the soil to have negative impacts involving volatilization, whereas prescribed fire rarely burns at a depth or at high enough temperatures to cause that to occur. So generally speaking, impacts to soil are not great, or they're not high enough to cause impact. So meaning not particularly high. And then this is looking at like different burns and the depth and the maximum temperatures. And again, when you're looking at low burns, most of them are staying below the threshold at which they're going to cause some of those impacts. So this is where you're going to see water repellency, which I didn't talk about from the last slide, but that's another impact from fire to soil where you get basically hydrophobicity, where there's enough charcoal and other materials in the soil that it doesn't allow water to penetrate, and then it rolls right off, and that can create a lot of erosion problems. So you don't really get that until in higher burn scenarios. Rarely do you see water repellent layers form from prescribed fire, but you do frequently see that in wildfire scenarios. Then I'm going to skip this slide because it was one that I didn't mean to include. But looking at some of the post-fire fungi, it's a similar scenario where if you don't volatilize the soil, you have plenty of means for decomposers and mycorrhizae to form post-burn. They really, a lot of them really appreciate the environment that's disturbed. That there's a reason morels tend to proliferate in burns, because that disturbed environment also creates nutrients for them to use. So they will frequently use the nutrients from ash, and they can reduce some of the loss of water from the environment. So when prescribed burns are introduced, they produce effects that are more favorable to mycorrhizae development and fungal development than you would see in a wildfire. And these are just some of the examples of mushrooms that you'll see in Central Oregon after a burn. I've seen a lot of these, especially up top, these cup fungi, actually in both wildfires and prescribed fires. So this is kind of getting back to the basics, which I think you guys should be pretty familiar with, the different kind of wildland fire types. So ground fires and surface fires are typically what you see in most prescribed fire scenarios. Ground fires can occur in isolated forms. There's not a whole lot of prescribed fire that induces ground fire. One exception to that is burning in juniper. If you're trying to do an overstory juniper removal using fire as the main tool, which is pretty edgy burning, but it's occurred plenty of times out there in Central Oregon, then yeah, you're trying to make a ground fire occur, but most of the time it's really ground and surface fire that's being induced. And when we're looking at the intensity of something that's burning relative to how severely it affects something, it's important to distinguish. So a lot of times you'll hear the terms intensity and severity used interchangeably, but intensity has to do with how the fire burns, and severity has to do with what it does to the environment it burns. So this is just kind of a cute graphic that is talking about intensity, and all that really refers to is heat energy released, and it's measured in flame length and height, temperature, and duration. And so those are, you know, analogous roughly to ground, surface, and ground fire. And you're looking at mortality or severity, then you're looking at the impact, and that's the product of intensity, as I said. So there's two kinds of severity that we look at. One is free mortality, and then the other is the effects to soil. So high intensity can create high severity impact, but not always. So I find that interesting that, you know, sometimes a fire will burn so quickly and hot over the area that it doesn't have the residency time to have as much of an impact. So, so these are just examples where in the same fire scar, you can have complete canopy removal, but you can have low severity soil burn. And that's really just because of that difference. So it's not always the case, but typically there is a relationship. So again, another thing that I wanted to point out and talk a little bit about is fire resilience and how that relates to mortality. I really like this graphic, and I don't take credit for it. I got it from but I think it describes pretty well how how inducing mortality in how inducing mortality in a prescribed burn. You know what, this slide did not come over into my into this. I'm not going to be able to tell you guys this one, unfortunately, because it didn't. Well, yes, I will. I'll just explain it. It doesn't have all the stuff in it because it blacked out when I brought it over into a different format. But at any rate, when you see those top two lines, what those are basically saying is like you'll have this fire event where these things drop off because you've changed that. And that's the point at which you release something else that's been suppressed, and then it takes off. And so that's kind of the concept of fire resilience in prescribed fire, is that you are inducing mortality, you are taking something away, but you're doing it to increase the vitality of something else. And so this is the way I try to think about it. And again, I apologize for this graphic not being perfect, but I think you probably get the idea. And you also see over time, in the absence of mortality or disturbance, some things will bounce back, but maybe this other thing never comes back. Maybe it's always gone, but this other thing's not really gone. It just is deterred for a bit. All right, so now I'm going to get into the nuts and bolts of what prescribed burns look like, and then I'll leave some time for questions. So this is what I'm sure many of you are familiar with in terms of projects in the Bend and Sisters area. Everything from, this is starting at Glazed Meadow. I don't know if they have stuff going further north now in a new photo, but all these different projects that are intended to try to protect the communities of Central Oregon from the unintended impacts of wildfire. And prescribed fire is really the big ticket item that is most challenging to implement. And I know that there's been some impacts from some of the smokes from recent prescribed fires in Bend, and some of that is from trying to figure out how to get more prescribed fire on the ground, because there's no way that the pace and scale at current levels is going to meet the need. So here's the fuels that we're looking at all around us, and this is not too bad in the moment of that photo being taken, right? But those needles cure out and turn into something that becomes an issue. Decadent bitterbrush, juniper, sage. These are the things that like to burn. Homes, of course, too. All fuels. Looking at the size classes and how we think about fuels when we're burning. I think this is kind of a helpful chart because it gives you examples of fuel size classes, and you might wonder why we refer to them in terms of hours, 1 hour, 10 hour. That has to do with what we call time lag in the fuel's response to changes in temperature and relative humidity in the environment. So 1 hour means quickly that fuels that are less than a 1/4 inch diameter quickly dry out and become available. Whereas things that are 1,000 hours or 10,000 hours are large branches, logs, trunks on the ground, and they take a long time to dry out. And so it's really those fuels that are in the 1 to 100 hour size classes that we are most concerned about, and that's what gets treated primarily in prescribed fires. When in wildfire scenarios, most of the time, all the fuels are available. Maybe not the 10,000 hour fuels necessarily. Sometimes those don't become fully available. They'll burn on the outside a bit, but they won't on the inside. But those smaller fuel size classes are the target of prescribed fire. So when I'm looking at an area to decide if I'm going to burn it, I'm assessing the vegetation conditions primarily. And that is really in terms of so many different factors that affect fire behavior. So everything on this chart on the right hand side, everything in the middle is fire behavior related, and the stuff on the outside is fuels related. So how moist is it? The size and the shape? Are there chemicals or oils in it that like to burn? How is it vertically and horizontally arranged? How loaded is it into the area? And what is the compactness? And what's its overall arrangement in general? And so that's what you have to start with. And as you plan and game out how something's going to burn. Well, now, when you get in the swing of doing it, then maybe that assessment is very quick. It just depends. When you're looking at what the burn actually looks like on the ground, it's sort of like taking a wildfire and putting it and reversing it. Where in a wildfire, let's just say you would be starting with like number 6 here. That's the way it burns. There's a little point and then it spreads from there. And that's the way this was meant to burn, because it's being lit into something that's already been lit. So really, when you're starting with the prescribed fire, it's burning into the wind, into something that's already been burned, as opposed to lighting something and sort of following it to wherever it's going to go. And so oftentimes, because prescribed fires are planned events as opposed to unplanned events, you can use natural fire breaks. Make sure that you take the lines to the roads, put the lines in before you have lit typically. Sometimes people will put the line in after they've started, but most of the time your lines are going to be in before you even get going. Trucks with water are typically used, if not a truck, a tank, or a folded tank with a pump and a hose system, hose lay. And yeah, so it's really like you create kind of what we would think of as a catcher's mitt, this big black line, and then you start moving from there. Now, when you're burning underneath trees, the intensity has to be managed as you go. And so it's more than just sending fire into a big catcher's mitt. You're looking at what you're sending fire into in the overhead and vertical and horizontal planes both at the same time. But this is kind of a nice picture of what the burn actually looks like. And you can see there too, they show you where the wind's going. So it's taking fire back into areas that have already been burned. There's so many different factors that go into planning for the burn and how you're going to determine whether or not, not whether or not, but what you need to make it successful and what parameters under which you're going to burn. You might look at the dominant wind patterns in an area to determine whether or not you're going to meet your smoke management objectives. You're going to need to map an area out and look at all of the different hazards present or things that are values that need to be considered. And modeling or predicting where your smoke might go is usually a part of that. And creating parameters under which you'll consider it acceptable to burn. You know, you may, in some cases, require that it's hot and dry to get your burn accomplished. In other cases, it's going to be cooler and wetter, and it all depends on the objectives, the fuels, and then what's acceptable. I mean, if you're burning on federal land and the feds are more or less, the Forest Service is more or less authorizing itself, then they're not getting a permit. Whereas if a certified burn manager who's private landowner goes to ODF, they're going to be told what the parameters are. So some of these parameters are going to be ones that are determined for you, or other times they're going to be internally determined. But regardless, they're super important for ensuring that the conditions under which a burn is lit are predicted to not result in unintended impacts, whether that's a wildfire or some kind of damage that you're not looking to induce with fire within the burn unit. The prep for burning can look a lot of different ways. Oftentimes there's hand line construction and cutting involved. Sometimes you're using your black lining. I've seen plows used in grass burns. This is down in the right hand space there, that's a line burner that gets used to put in a line in grass when it won't really burn well. Otherwise, it actually kind of uses the air curtain technology to pump heat down and make it burn. Most of the time though, we're really trying to find existing lines. So but prep can also involve taking down snags, digging around trees that are particularly sensitive to fire or have a huge basal accumulation of litter. There's kind of mixed reviews on raking around large old trees and the impacts of that, timing of that, whether that's needed. But long unburned stands of ponderosa have shown impacts from fire that needed some prep work. So in Central Oregon, that could be a consideration. But the main take home from my standpoint about this piece is that if you want to have a successful burn that isn't stressful, then do a lot of good prep so that you take as much of your worry away as you can, because you can often do that with good preparation. On burn day proper, there's a lot of monitoring of air quality and weather, both on site and from sources such as the National Weather Service. Thinking about whether or not you're adding smoke to existing air quality issues that might be occurring in the area. In some places, that's going to be mandated through a permit process, in other places, not so much. But regardless, for the good of the order in terms of prescribed fire social license, it's good to consider those things and try to burn under the conditions that are most likely to not make things worse if they're already problematic. And then I think this is just my slide to make sure I take a minute to talk about the art of burning. You know, there's a lot of scientific inputs that go into lighting a prescribed burn, and there's modeling and there's permitting and planning and notifications and all these processes. But when you actually start lighting it, a lot of it's kind of artful in the sense that fire will move around and do different things. It messes with the weather in its own environment. It will draw wind toward, well, it will change winds in its own environment. And so you have to work with that. And so it's not a linear process once you get started in terms of simply having an input from a weather reading and then having to go with that. You really got to work with the way the fire is burning and how it changes when it enters different fuel types. And it's really fun. And I think for me, the most rewarding part of it actually is just, kind of having that interplay and developing that whole process and hopefully getting really good results from it. Because even though this is a beautiful picture and I really love the way fire looks when it's burning, I don't do it for this. I do it for what comes afterwards. These are just some examples of ignitions techniques that are used. They're folks in this upper left hand corner are actually firing into the wind. So we're kind of thinking of as a flanking fire pattern. This one here is setting a backing fire. So it's going to back off the green grass into the unburnt or into the dried out grass. The person down and this person's using a drip torch. Lower left, this guy's using a fusee. This person's using a fusee. So these are both techniques in terms of patterns, but also some of the devices used. This is a very pistol. So at times pistol or flare gun type devices will be used to get heat built interior or to send fire into an area where you don't really want to send people, but you need to get some fire established. Let's see. Okay. This is going to play. Hopefully you guys can see it. I think it's really cool. So this is kind of showing, and this is easier to see with a grass burn, what it looks like to be lighting a strip head fire into something that's already burned. But that's really a good example of a strip head firing technique there, where you basically light a strip and it burns into the strip that you've already lit or the black line that you've already lit. Very common technique in understory and broadcast burning. This is a broadcast burn because it's out in the open, but understory burning similar. And we just watched that. Some of the things that used for holding, yeah, typically a lot of engines are used. Sometimes there's a folded tanks and hose lays put in. Occasionally people use bladder bags to do some work for that. Those areas that don't require a full hose lay but need some access by foot. And that's just another example of holding using engines, in some of these grass burning scenarios, you'll have one kind of behind to just pick up anything that the first engine didn't get. And then when you're done, you're often going to need to seed or check with a Palm IR camera to see if everything's out. Pull all your hose and equipment. So, I mean, it's not the exciting part that everyone talks about, but a lot of times after the burn's done, you've got more work to do. But if it's the final treatment in a suite of restorations to get it back to sort of a fire maintained state, then, maybe you're Palm IRing and pulling hose, but you're not seeding, you're just trying to beat the brush back. But, I think I like this slide because I kind of think it shows like, this is the difference between what happens when it's long unburned and it's frequently burned. And what we're doing is we're just releasing a lot of the stuff that gets locked up in the litter and the dust layer back into the mineral soil. And, the more we can do that and keep that intact, the better. I meant to work in a couple other slides, but I'm going to go ahead and end my presentation and let you guys ask questions.
Amanda, this is Kevin Moriarty. I think when I was on a Prescribed Fire Council meeting, I think you were on it, and you were talking about the certified burn manager program. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So is that essentially a way to credential private landowners to have some capacity to be fire practitioners and to do prescribed fire at some level? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to talk about that. All right, so I'll tell the story real quick about certified burn manager. Oregon passed a bill in 1999 to authorize ODF to stand up a certified burn manager program, which is a training and certification program for non-federal burners. And it comes with some limited liability protection. And so ODF was not told it had to stand that program up. It was told it could do that if it wanted to. And so it didn't. And there's several different reasons for that. There was some pressure not to do it because of concerns over timber loss or other losses that were going to be hard to recover from. If people started burning things so there was just not it didn't have the critical mass or the social interests that we have now in prescribed fire either. So that was quite a long time ago. And then the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council found that bill and started elevating it again. And then Sustainable Northwest and the Nature Conservancy worked with the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council to introduce a bill that ended up becoming part of the omnibus wildfire bill, Senate Bill 762. And the original bill was 2572, which included two things. One is the certified burn manager program, and then the other was clearing up language around cross-boundary burning, because before that was passed, if fire crossed a land ownership boundary in Oregon, it was considered prima facie evidence for a wildfire. So cross-boundary burning was technically illegal in Oregon before Senate Bill 762 was passed. So now that says if both landowners are in agreement, then that's allowed. And then the other piece of it, certified burn manager, was that was then turned into a ODF shall implement the program. And so then they made a fiscal request to hire a coordinator, which is my position. And essentially what we're doing is we are creating a training program that will be delivered by training providers such as Oregon State University Extension and other community colleges, National Wildfire Suppression Association, many of the contractors out there. And that training can be then delivered. Now, to be clear, we're not necessarily saying that anyone who's never done any burning at all should come and try to do certified burn manager. We're really not encouraging that. We're encouraging people that have some experience and want to develop themselves towards being able to lead burns. And so assuming you have some experience with prescribed fire, you take the training and then you get issued a certification book, and that certification book, you will work with someone who's already certified as a certified burn manager to complete your certification book. And then once you're done with that, so you do the training, pass the exam, work through your certification book, and then you get a certification from ODF to lead burns on private land, or not, I should say non-federal land, really, any ODF protected land. Now this does not apply outside of ODF protection. And and then when I say limited liability protection, I mean that it does not take away the suppression liability. And if you're found negligent, then that doesn't apply either. But what the statute does say is that if a certified burn manager is used, then no one on the burn, including the landowner, shall be held liable for damages. So I should look back at the exact language, but anyway, so that is the certified burn manager program. The training will be, I think it will end up being a 3-day training. I mean, training providers can choose to make it longer if they want to, but I don't see how they'll get through it in less than 3 days. And the content will vary to some extent. So we are finalizing our instructor guide. We have an exam already ready to go. And so then what will happen is the instructor guide will be taken and then used to create curriculum content. And that content can, if for the industry side of things, for example, they want to really just hone in on pile burning or slash management, then they can make their training about that. And OFIC and or Oregon Forest Industries Council or Associated Oregon Loggers will likely be using this and will want to put on their own training. So they don't necessarily want to put on the same training as the Nature Conservancy might want to put on, or OSU Extension. OSU Extension will be publishing theirs so that anyone can just pull their content and go use it if they want to. And then there is a historical recognition component, which what that means is that if you have been leading burns already, or you are a type 2 burn boss and you would like to apply to not have to take the training, then you can do that. And in some cases, you may have to take the exam. But if you're already a type 2 burn boss, then we will just be issuing the certification to folks who are already type 2 burn bosses. And part of why we're doing that is because we need a group of folks who are certified to then mentor others who are working on their certification books. Is that getting to what you're looking for, Kevin? Or
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I just heard about it, and it sounds like it's an opportunity to provide training for private landowners. It sounds like non-federal organizations in general might, whether it's like park and rec districts or, contractors, folks like that might be more applicable. Private landowners as well. I don't know if private landowners have the skill set to do underburns, but maybe that opportunity is out there. So.
They do in Jackson County. The Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association, they came and helped me burn on the OSU Collins demonstration forest down there. And we wouldn't have gotten that burn done if they hadn't come. And I was amazed by how, they brought an engine. They were so good. They've been practicing. They've been burning on private land down there. So they're really excited about the program because they've already been burning through their cooperative, bouncing, one landowner to the next. I think they've done like 5 burns now.
Yeah.
And so, but that doesn't exist all over the state. Every part of the state's different in terms of landowner interest in actually getting out on the ground to do the work. So, but the key with the certified burn manager that I should probably key point that I should make is that it is a reduced barrier entry point to prescribed fire, meaning we don't have a physical fitness test. There aren't, it took me 8 years to get qualified as a type 2 burn boss. And that was what I would consider to be kind of a fast track. I knew I wanted to become a burn boss, and I was, being favored somewhat because of my drive to do it and interest. And so I got all my training and I got a lot of opportunities, up front, and wasn't in a lot of competition. But most units, it's going to take 10 to 12 years at least for someone to get that qual. And so this is not like that. But we're also not anticipating that certified burn managers are going to be leading the kind of complex birds that type 2 burn bosses are. These are, smaller units, more, on private land that's been well treated. And like one of those prescribed burn association burns down in Jackson County, the landowner darn near raked the place. So it was like, how are you? They had to really try to make it burn, So, in some, that's so I'm saying like, that is not the same as like trying to treat, everything outside of Bend up into the mountains and stuff. So yeah, it's a reduced barrier entry point to prescribed fire. And I do think the training will be really useful for folks, even if they don't do the certification, because it will help them learn about how to engage as practitioners, even if they don't lead burns. So, and to get all the information about the permitting that's required, what the law says, what the process looks like. And the way that the training is structured is a little different than most of the trainings that I've seen or been a part of, and we decided to make it more really kind of chronological. So walking through the process, so you want to burn a unit. Okay, what does the pre-planning look like? What does it look like if you actually decide to start planning and doing it? What does it look like to prep it? What does it look like to mobilize? What does it look like to actually burn it? And once you're done, you're actually not done. When is it really out? And how do you ensure that you're not walking away from something that becomes ODF's next wildfire? So because of course, that's this agency's real big concern about this, is not creating more problems on the landscape. One more thing really quick. Senate Bill 80 did pass I believe that passed last Friday. And that included one fix for the certified burn manager, which it previously did not apply to all land within ODF protection. It only applied to forested land. And so I believe that got changed. And then there's a prescribed fire liability pilot, which is similar to what California has done in creating a claims fund, which if you're using a certified burn manager or a cultural burn practitioner, there's a couple other criteria. But if you're using leadership under a certain criteria for your burn and you've done everything according to the process, and you have an escape that causes damages that you get sued for, it is a claims fund for that. Or maybe not just sued, but claims for damages in general caused by the prescribed burn. So that'll be interesting. Who knows if we'll ever use it. My hope is that we don't, but that includes a wildfire investigator position as well within ODF for the purpose of investigating a wildfire if it's associated with a prescribed burn and there's a claim for it. So those are some pretty recent updates to share too, that are associated with the certified burn manager.
I've got a question. Greg Brent from Fisheries for Woods. How do you coordinate with the federal forest management as to, I'm assuming they have prescribed fires also, and so you got to coordinate with them?
Yeah, for example, like all this, smoke management goes through it goes through ODF. So that's one point of coordinating, because, two different folks putting up smoke.
Right.
I think there's room for doing more of that. I've seen a lack of coordination even where there was intent to be more coordinated between feds and private land burners. So I think there's work to be done there yet. And part of that's because there's two different lines of permission, right? So the smoke has to go through the same shop, but not for burn permitting. So that's really the only single gatekeeper. And then that doesn't even apply equally to everything. That's a whole other can of worms. But essentially there are times when DEQ is actually the regulatory entity for smoke. So even then, like ODF being the one they're not always required for smoke management necessarily. Yeah, in some parts of the state, there is coordination between the private and the Fed sides as far as burning goes. But I've been talking with Trevor Miller from over in the Deschutes about some of the private lands burning that they have assumed responsibility for, because they would like to get some help with some of that work. And I think that is one each of these places are inroads to better coordination. But when there's no requirement for it, and it makes it tougher. I will say though, that when cross-boundary work starts happening, then that kind of just solves it right there. But when it's just about neighbors informing each other what one another's doing, it doesn't get, there's notifications happening, but it's not the same as coordinating and working together.
Another question from Greg Bryant, Future Woods. How often do you get a crew that's ready to do a prescribed burn and all of a sudden the conditions aren't ready for the burn to happen, and so you have to call it off?
That happens. I would say, like, I don't know, that's probably happened to me like 5 times. I mean, it does happen. And, as to whether or not people you've got a ton of money invested in that group that day. I mean, that's where it gets tricky, right? Like if you paid all this money for these people to show up and then it's not a good day, that's hard. That can be tough. Whereas if folks were, in the community, they all showed up and then things didn't work out and you just went back to what you were doing, maybe not as big a deal. But regardless, it doesn't feel good because you're trying so hard and it's not easy to assemble and mobilize to burn. So, if you have to say no go, that's yeah, but I've done it. And so it's better to do that and not have something happen that you got to deal with than to burn because you paid a bunch of money for people to be there or you're feeling that pressure. But it's one of my least favorite things for sure.
I've got another question.
Yeah, that's what I'm here for.
Approximately, what's a percentage of your prescribed burns that have gone out of control just because of certain conditions changed or whatever it is? You think?
Well, there's the Forest Service 99 point something. I mean, it's like less than 0.5% or 0.5% failure rate, right? And personally, I have a very good record. I haven't lost one yet. Hopefully never, knock on wood. I'm not one of those people that's like, you haven't lived till you lost a burn. I'm like, no, I'm not trying to lose a burn ever.
Who wants to lose a burn?
Nobody wants to, but there is in some parts of the prescribed fire community, it's a way to make people feel better when they lose a burn. It's not that they tell you, nobody says that to you when you haven't. It's when somebody loses a burn, they will say it to make people feel better. Like, oh, well, it happens to everyone in your career. Now you've really been doing it because, you did it so much that you lost one or whatever. And I'm just like, yeah, they can have that. I'm like mostly trying to have my burns be as zen as possible. I want to be like, have it all set up to be successful so that I'm not worried about it and I don't want to lose one. But yeah, here's the deal about losing a burn. It's not about the, how often it happens. It's about the consequences when it does happen. And we've actually gotten really good at avoiding prescribed fires turning into wildfires. Like we're really good at keeping them where we want them, to the point that we're down to like a very, small window of failure. And that one it's not good when it does happen, basically, right? It's what happened in New Mexico, and so yeah, that's basically what I'm preoccupied with, is the rare event failures and prescribed fires that cause a lot of damage and harm, because it's not often that it happens, but generally when it does, it's a problem. I mean, we have slop overs and we have spots and we have things that maybe even, I mean, there was a burn at the Finley or up at the Basket Butte National Wildlife Refuge in the Willamette Valley a couple years, well, it was like 2019, where they had like 211 bonus acres and they were running a plow, burning off the plow line, just barely keeping it on the refuge. And nobody heard about that, but that was a firefight if there ever was one. I mean, to put out their own burn. But but you don't hear about that because there was no damage. They don't want the publicity around it. Nobody got hurt. They kept it in the box. It only burned up more burn units that they wanted to burn anyway. So there was like no real harm done, even though I'm sure people felt it from, the work they did that day and into the night to catch it. So that's why I say that, we don't even think of that as a failure really, right? Because they caught it. But so the stuff that we do hear about that is a problem is so bad that, that's what we need to prevent. So I think of prescribed fire as it's like, it's a perfectionist's line of work, because you have no room for failure. You don't. And we've gotten I've gotten our window down to that 0.5, whatever it is, %. And we got to keep at it. We don't stop there because you know, that window is still there and it's not acceptable. That said, if we're gonna expand prescribed fire and ramp up the pace and scale, we can't expect to do that without having more problems with it. You know, and that's why I was really glad to see ODF ask for a wildfire investigator along with the prescribed fire liability pilot, because, you know, you can't just say that we're gonna potentially have that happen and then not prepare for it. Yeah. Anyways, but I have a good record, and Forest Service has a good record. Prescribed fire has a good record when it comes to frequency. But again, the severity of the failures when they do occurs is significant. But it's no different than the fact that we've gotten wildfires. We fought fire so well to where the only fires that we have that are burning anymore are horrendous, because we've taken all the ones that are doing nothing but good off the land, and all we're left with is those. It's very similar from like a risk management perspective.
Hey, Amanda, this is Craig Letts. Good to see you. It's been a while. And I
Yeah,
just wanted to add on to that a little bit, because we've learned from our mistakes, right? So one of the things that I've seen happen throughout my career is that prescribed fire, if there was a loss or an escape, it used to be head on a chopping block kind of action. And nobody intends to lose a burn. There are occasions where there can be blatant disregard for some policy or planning or things like that. But I just want to throw that out there, that it should be a learning curve. There are there's a lot of variables that go into a burn, the weather, the fuels, those types of things. So I think that federal agencies have gotten much better about trying to learn from the mistake, fix policy if there's a problem with policy, but it shouldn't be this, unless there was a blatant disregard, it shouldn't be head on a chopping block kind of a thing for the burn boss, because they're working really hard to do the right thing for the land and the folks.
absolutely. Hear to that. And I think that's the biggest problem, is targeting individuals who are just trying to fix a big mess out there on the land, you know, and nobody's trying to mess that up. Nobody's being knowingly negligent. Everybody's doing their very best. And yeah, it's I mean, any burn boss's worst nightmare, you know, to have that on their watch, really. And that's why we're all working so hard to prevent it and learning from our mistakes. And that's what I think the Forest Service does the best job of, is a learning culture, you know, and going back and looking at things with an honest eye and, you know, trying to learn from it. I mean, I'm not saying that some of the remedies as a result, I don't know if I agree with all of those, but I really appreciate the amount of attention that goes into looking at what has happened when problems have occurred. But I think what you're talking about, Craig, some of the culture around targeting individuals is what keeps people from wanting to do the important work of leading burns. So working to figure out how to support those individuals and doing that important work is key.
I have a comment to add on to that, Amanda. It's Sean Hackett with Kaufmanson. You know, I think the value of ODF standing up a certified burn program is very important, because it's going to increase that communication flow from the Forest Service, you know, doing a prescribed fire, but then we have private landowners that, you know, can also see the benefits from also doing that. And so bringing us together at the table in the pre-planning stage will help with that coordination and help with that effort across the landscape. And so, you know, some of the escapes that have happened and conversions that have happened from prescribed fire to wildfires, because maybe some fire has gone on to that private land, which isn't, you know, there's a hard line in the sand. Well, we can have that coordination and that communication up front and earlier, where we don't have to have that hard line in the sand. We can have that, you know, ability to communicate and bring resources in and work together on incorporating that piece of land into the prescribed fire while we are out there doing it on both sides of the line. So I think it's going to be a huge benefit. And we'll see that increase over the next few years as we start to implement that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think that, yeah, like you're saying, that's those conversations ahead of time. And just figuring out how to, well, again, I mean, some of it has to do with ODF stepping into this space now finally. And then doing so in a thoughtful way, like our folks are varying in terms of their comfort with jumping into burning and getting that important work done. And that's why certified burn manager is so important, because technically, I don't know how many people know this, but ODF has been authorized under statute for a long time to lead burns on private land and to do prescribed fire. It's just that the perception of the agency of itself and the focus on, what is our mission. And, suppression has been the primary mission, but we are shifting gears. And so I think our department's going to be able to come to the table in a different way, but we're also empowering landowners and private folks to also do the same thing. So that's, kind of trying to unlock capacity that's existing. And we talk a lot about how do we build capacity for prescribed fire. And I've been trying to think about, before we build something, how do we tap into what we already have that's not being utilized? And ODF is a pretty big resource to that end. But after seeing those folks down in the Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association, I was really impressed. I mean, they kind of appeared ragtag at first, like they are like Southern Oregon hippies out of the woods, kind of like, and it was like, wait a minute, but they were dialed, they knew what they were doing, they listened, they used their radios, they had their hard hats, they were like, did all their stuff, and I was just like, okay, this is happening in Oregon finally. And in California, they've got like 22 of these groups that have formed now. So it's a piece of the puzzle, but like really what I'm excited about is, because I really enjoyed my federal career. I miss it a lot at times. And I always say, I still bleed green, and I still, I'm like, Forest Service is a huge part of my career and my background. So I'm really supportive of the agency overall and other federal agencies as well. But the pieces that are missing of this big puzzle are part of what I get to work on now, which is, again, ODF resources and folks out in the world who want to burn and who don't have really access to that environment and kind of need an avenue to get there. So we'll see how we can piece some of this together. But there's lots of different things to consider with regards to partnering, and I'm excited to do more of that. I feel like I have some good inroads there already, but also a lot of things have happened since I left there that have created really enabling conditions. Some of the work on private land and such. So
I think something to not lose focus on is, the good work that we're going to put on the landscape, or even what we do, but really telling our story and educating the public on the collaboration that we currently have going on. And then as we start to implement some of, more cross-boundary work, is really showcasing that and educating that public. Because they need to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, how we're doing it. Not just seeing the smoke in the air and not understanding the why behind it.
yeah, agreed. And that's I think something that ODF is still also working on in terms of its how and whether it tells its story about its work that's related to prescribed fire. Some of that started to happen, but I think getting more into the details and finding different approaches to that, I'd be interested in hearing more.
Any question?
Yes, Dean Richardson, Upper Chutes River Communities. Thanks for presenting today. I think we're more familiar, most people are more familiar with what the federal government's doing through the Forest Service with prescribed fires. But you mentioned the pace and scale. The landscape doesn't know these boundaries, and so we really need to use prescribed fire in a way that helps us going forward. I have noticed that the messaging is pretty consistent now as, calling it prescribed fire. But I have noticed that when it's being done, some of the old signage says controlled burn. And I think that that was one of the problems before with the public is they didn't understand all the variables, and if one burn escapes, it's really bad PR along with the damage that it's done. Last year, I guess was New Mexico had that incident, and there was a good sized prescribed burn going on at the time near me, and they just had to stop halfway through. And I think that, I don't know if it shut it down for the whole rest of the season, but it really caused a disruption there. For the private lands and the certification process that you're talking about, different areas need different strategies, but we have like sometimes large private lands that haven't been entered for a long time, haven't really been managed, and they have to go through different steps, maybe pre-commercial thinning and then hand thinning and piling. But I think more education is really needed for how to manage slash and do pile burning. And even on smaller properties, it's allowed here on even like half-acre lots. And people are dumb about that, even though the information is all out there. And every year, the local fire districts have debris burn piles that escape, and it only takes one of those to turn into a large event. So I think that kind of training could be really valuable if it was out there a little bit more, that people could get better information on how to manage slash and do pile burning on private lands. Thank you.
Yeah, I know OSU Extension has put together some training, and I think Offrey might have done one of their webinars. There's at least a couple webinars out there on slash management, pile burning, and I know that's a continual focus in our prevention program is debris burning. So I agree that's important. One thing I wanted to mention regarding the signage, just so everyone understands why that is, there's state ODOT requirements for signing roads that require like certain language to be used. And so it's part of why those signs say controlled burn ahead, because that's actually what's required in ODOT's permit. So even though there's prescribed fire, controlled burn, what is it? I just use both terms. I usually use prescribed fire, but the Nature Conservancy did a study where they looked at the use of the term controlled burning versus prescribed fire and found the public preferred controlled burning. And so that ended up being, something that they adopted. So, but I understand the confusion there, and I think that can be kind of challenging at times. So that would be my only comment about that. Agreed on education around slash management and debris burning, and that being, we're hoping to maybe catch a few of those folks with the pile burn. This is one more thing I forgot to mention. The Certified Burn Manager program will have 2 certifications, pile burn and broadcast understory. The broadcast understory will automatically include a pile burn certification, but for some folks, they will only get a pile burn certification. So they're not getting certified to burn broadcast. They're just doing piles. And we may or may not get the people that are out there willy-nilly burning and not really paying attention, but maybe we'll catch a few of them. Regardless, we'll be educating others and hopefully reducing some of those problems.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, guys, I hate to cut it short. It is 9:30. Amanda, that was an awesome presentation. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
That was even better discussion. Thank you, everybody. And it was
Yeah.
see some old faces and hear some old voices that I haven't heard in a while.
And I'm sure there will probably be more questions for you. I will be sharing your presentation with the group through meeting minutes in the newsletter. So you might get some more questions.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone have anything for the good of the order? We're kind of at the end of the meeting here, so.
Or prescribed fireplace.
All right, I like it. Yeah, no, thanks again, Amanda. That was really informative, and I think we're gonna see more of that certified firm manager program in the future as far as getting people signed up for it. All right. With that, thank you for everyone attending, and that concludes our Project Wildfire meeting.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
I guess I'll be calling you.
I know it got started.
Yeah. Well, last month I got through.
Drives me